Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa ba'd. All right, we are on section 39 of Surah Al-Baqarah, last section before the surah ends. So we're on verse 282, two verses. The reason why we're covering only two verses is because verse 282 is long. It's the longest verse in the entire Quran. The one verse is an entire one verse. So this is the longest verse, and it's about debts, which is interesting. Documenting a debt is the longest verse in the Quran, which tells you something. It tells you that detailed rules about things and transactions between people is very important, because you can defraud other people. You can be unjust to somebody else. So justice is something that's highly, highly emphasized in the Quran, to the extent of having so many details. Okay, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا تداينتم بدين إلى أجل مسمى فاكتبوه. So he says, believers, when you borrow money that is due after a specified time period, make sure to write it down, right? So the reason why you write it down is because that's going to be evidence. So this is usually referring to if you're not in a marketplace, right? And even if you're in a marketplace, but usually people used to travel around. And let's say you're going somewhere and you're with your friend or something like that, and you're like, I need to borrow some money. And when we already saw, previous weeks, that if you're borrowing money, you cannot be charging any interest at all. But if you're even still, when you borrow money from somebody else and you say, okay, I'm going to pay it back later, ajalim musamma, until a specified date, I'll pay you back. Usually you should put a specified date on that. So you know what? If I'm gonna borrow money from you, I'm gonna pay you back on July 7th. Right. So the person is expecting this is when they're gonna get their money back. That's not a requirement. Sometimes you'd be like, I'll pay you back as soon as I'm able to. Sometimes the soon can become many, many months. And it becomes a problem. Then it becomes like, friendships start to diminish. They start to get messed up when people are not doing fulfilling the responsibility that they have towards their brother and sister. But so it says, when you borrow money that's due, make sure you write it down. Now the wording is uktubu. It means write it down. Now wording in the Quran or in the Hadith, when it says you need to do something, usually the default is that you must do it. If Allah tells you to do something, you have to do it. It's a requirement. The only way you get an exception, there's some different ways you can get an exception. If the same verse later on says these are some exceptions to the rule, then you know that it was not an absolute command. It was like a restricted command, or it was a high recommendation, but not necessarily a command. So we're going to see, this is one of the prime examples that scholars use when they're studying to figure out when Allah says you have to do something, and the language is in the imperative form. Imperative means command form, as grammar. The imperative usually means you have to do it. Allah is telling you you have to do it. This is one of the few examples in the Quran where Allah tells you you have to do something, but you don't have to, you should. So it's like something usually should be fard, it should be like a requirement, but actually, due to different reasons that are going to be mentioned later in the verse, it's actually downgraded to a recommendation. Okay, so وَلْيَكْتُبْ بَيْنَكُمْ كَاتِبٌ بِالْعَدْلِ. Let someone write it down between you fairly. So it's saying that you should have somebody write the debt down. Now, why not write it yourself? See, this is interesting because this was Arabia. And in Arabia, majority of people could not read and write. So if they could not read and write, it actually is implied in the verse that have somebody who knows how to write it down, because there are not that many people who know how to write. So that's interesting, because that some people have challenged that. Some Orientalists have come along. These are like non-Muslim scholars who study Islam, and they're like, no, it's not true. The Prophet was literate and he could read and write, and so could many other people, and all of those stories about them not being able to do so is not true. I mean, it's built into the Quran directly, right? It's clear that was the general society, that they could not read and write. He says anyone, who's able to write it down, they should write it down. And it says bil adl, write it down fairly. Now, if you have somebody who has an expertise in something, like the ability to write where other people don't, or the ability to make a legal contract where somebody else doesn't know the legal language, you can't understand what, most people, if they read like a legal document, they wouldn't understand what it's saying. All these different terms and technicalities and all that. Most people, when you click that little button, it's like, I agree to the terms of service, right? Most people don't even read it, right? They just scroll down and then they don't even scroll. They just click okay. And even if they were to read it, they probably wouldn't even understand what they're saying. But so what happens is the person who makes that contract, or the person who's writing the contract, they need to do so with justice. Meaning they should not make like little clauses or little additions or modifications to what the people did not want. So you're borrowing money, is I'm going to borrow $100 from you. I'm going to pay you back after 1 month. And then if someone's writing it down and they want to play around a little bit, they'll be like, oh, but there's this one other stipulation, there's this one other exception, there's one other extension condition. You're not supposed to do that. That would be unjust if the people don't know what's happening. So he says the person who's writing should do it down fairly with justice. وَلَا يَأْبَ كَاتِبٌ أَن يَكْتُبَ كَمَا عَلَّمَهُ اللَّهُ. The writer should not refuse to write as Allah has taught him, right, or her to do so. So Allah taught them the ability in Arabia, which many people did not know. Allah gave the person the ability to learn reading and writing, which many people didn't know. Somebody who has more specialized knowledge, if you learn that, not just you, Allah has taught you and given you the ability to learn and get that degree and go to school and all of those things. So Allah is saying now here, the person who has knowledge and the ability to write, how hard is it to write down a very basic contract between two people? Say, Hussein owes Muhammad $100 and he borrowed it on this day and it is due in 3 months, right? It's not that hard to write it down. So he says, it's not that difficult. If someone has the ability to write, they're like, no, I don't want to do it. Like, this is important. They're asking for your services. You want to charge, you can charge them $1 for your $10, whatever, for your writing, however long that takes. Right now, we can just use AI and make a contract for us. But Allah is saying, don't do that, because by writing it down, you're actually helping people avoid disputes, right? So it doesn't take that much time. It doesn't take much effort. And what writing the contract down will do is it'll help people potentially avoid any problems or friction between them. If one person is like, no, you know what? You told me 2 months I could pay you back. The person said, what? $100? No, you borrowed $150 from me. It's like, no, it was $100. He goes, no, I think we discussed it and it became 150. Becomes a problem. So you want to make sure you write it down so there's no problems there. فليكتب وليملل الذي عليه الحق وليتق الله ربه ولا يبخس منه شيئا. He should write what the borrower says, fearing Allah, his Lord, and not playing any trick. So first it's saying he should write down what the borrower says. So who should be the one who's dictating and saying what the terms are? It's the one who's borrowing the money. So if there's somebody writing, person who's borrowing the money saying, I, Hussein, am borrowing $100 on this date, and I'm going to pay back Muhammad on this date, for whatever, for amount. So the reason why that is because the greater, the person who's making the claim, if there's a problem between them, they each have, one person's going to say one thing, one person's going to say another thing. The most common confusion is going to come from the person who's borrowing the money. The person who's borrowing is going to go ahead and make the dictation, or the other person can say, but the borrower has to confirm and say, that's exactly my understanding of what's happening as well. So they write it down. And whoever's writing doesn't play any trick. They don't make any modifications in the wording or something like that. فإن كان الذي عليه الحق سفيها أو ضعيفا أو لا يستطيع أن يمل فليملل وليه بالعدل. أن يمل هو فليملل وليه بالعدل. If the borrower is not competent, meaning the word here is safih. Safih means a fool or somebody who's foolish. But in this context, it means that this person doesn't have the ability to manage money properly. Now, that could be so many things. That could mean the person is, just doesn't understand contracts, doesn't understand how loans work, doesn't understand this, doesn't understand that. You say if the person doesn't have the ability, they don't know what they're doing, they don't understand how money, borrowing, and all that works, or the person is da'ifan. Da'ifan means weak, but in this context means they're immature or they're senile. They've not reached the age of maturity properly, but they have money. Or they become so old that they cannot function properly, they don't remember things or something like that. Oh, they're not able to dictate. They're not able to speak properly. Or let's say they don't speak the language, so they speak a foreign language. If there's something that's preventing them from being able to say what they're supposed to be saying, فَلْيُمْلِلْ وَلِيُّهُ بِالْعَدْلِ, then let his guardian, who manages his money for him normally, speak for him properly, meaning without any deception. So if let's say a kid is borrowing money, or an elderly person, or someone who has a little bit of incapacity to understand certain things, and somebody else manages their money for them, that other person is going to speak on their behalf and is going to be dictating the loan. Now you can imagine there's so much room for things to go wrong when it comes to a contract. And this applies to any type of contract. And that's why we have lawyers, and that's why contracts go into hundreds and hundreds of pages, because business is a really big deal. Nobody likes to have their money taken from them unjustly and wrongly. So you put on all these conditions and stipulations. And Allah is doing the exact same thing in the Quran. In the longest verse in the Quran is giving all these stipulations, saying, think about all of these scenarios. These are the things that can go wrong. So if the person can't do this, the other person is going to make sure that they're dictating. And when they're dictating, make sure that they are doing it bil adl, with justice. They're not misrepresenting the person. They're not saying, you know what, add another condition in there or something like that. وَاسْتَشْهِدُوا شَهِيدَيْنِ مِنْ رِجَالِكُمْ, call 2 of your men to witness. Now, this refers to not just random people, but the witnesses should be reliable people. And what are they witnessing? They're witnessing the agreement. So when you write this down, and again, this is all a high recommendation, right? When you're making an agreement and you're writing down the loan and someone's borrowing money, call 2 other people to witness and say, hey, what's going on here? So we got a document, and then we can have 2 witnesses as well. And when you have 2 witnesses, if there's a problem, we go, look, there's a document, but we want to call and say, hey, you know what, Ahmed, you were there when Hussein borrowed the money, right? How much was it? Was it $100 or was it 150? And what if that guy forgets? He's like, man, I don't remember. There was some discussion or something like that. He goes, okay, well, who's the second witness that was there? Say, oh, Adil was there. But okay, Adil, come here. What do you remember? So now you can clarify and you can make sure that, hey, people are not getting into dispute. They have some witness, that there's some way to avoid disputes or somebody being unjust to the other person. And that's the purpose behind this. Now, why didn't Allah say, call 5 witnesses? It would be safer. Right? The problem is, the more restrictions you put, the more difficult your life becomes. Like, I can't even have a transaction. Like, I'm just trying to buy something. I'm just trying to borrow a little amount of money. Every single time I got to call 5 people. I got to call 10 people to witness. It makes it too difficult. If you have too little criteria, too few rules, then you open yourself up to problems. So when Allah is making these rules for us and he's defining this is called Sharia, right? This is called the laws of Islam, what Allah wants us to do. He's always taking into consideration this balance between, we want to protect people so that they don't get stuck in contracts and there's injustice happening, but we don't want to make it so difficult for people, on the other hand, that everything becomes burdensome. You can't even really do business much because you have too many conditions and too many restrictions. And if you look in society, in any society, whenever it comes to business contracts, the problems always arise from one of the 2 extremes. Either too many rules, you can't get anything done, no freedom to, there's no efficiency in the system. There's many economies, many countries today, there's so much inefficiency in their system, there's red tape, there's so much paperwork, there's so much rules and requirements that they're like, it just halts the entire system and you can't get things done properly. And then the opposite is you have too few regulations. And when you have too few rules, that's when you have things like so much deception taking place. You have people, resenting the type of transactions. And if you look at the housing collapse of 2009, right here in America, this is exactly what it was. It was due to too few rules and regulations from the American government. It's a fantastic documentary called Inside Job, narrated by famous actor Matt Damon. It's a really good analysis of what happened in this 2009 housing crisis bubble. And when you look at it, the whole video, pretty much the summary is there weren't enough rules, and no one was regulating what people are doing in their business, and that's what led to the entire meltdown of the entire economy. So you need to have more regulations in place. When you don't have proper regulations, other people will be taken advantage of. And then if you have too many regulations, you can't get anything done, right? So there has to be that balance, and you find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is putting that balance. فإن لم يكونا رجلين فرجل وامرأتان ممن ترضون من الشهداء أن تضل إحداهما فتذكر إحداهما الأخرى. If two men cannot be found, then one man and two women that you agree on. And if one of the women forgets, the other can remind her. Or if she forgets or if she makes a mistake, then the other one can remind her. So if you don't have two men, then there's going to be one man and there's going to be two women instead, in place of them. I'm going to talk about this after we finish the verse in more detail about why that is. But this is the rule. So it's, again, this rule is a high recommendation. It's not an absolute requirement that you have to do any of these things. وَلَا يَأْبَ الشُّهَدَاءُ إِذَا مَا دُعُوا. The witnesses must not refuse if called on. So if the witnesses are called on later on, say, hey, these two got into an argument, and one of them is saying it's $100, one of them saying it's $150. One of them said it's 1 month, one of them said it was 2 months. What are the people going to do? They're going to call upon these witnesses and say, hey, we need you to come and tell us, testify, what do you remember? What did you hear? What are the details that you came across? And those witnesses should not say, I don't want to do it, or I'm too busy, or you kind of favor one person and you're like, I don't want to do it because if I witness, this is my friend. I don't want, my friend is claiming it's 150. I don't want to witness against my friend. Otherwise, it'll put him in a difficult situation. You should not do that. You have to be impartial to people, and you have to be favoring justice. What matters is justice, not your personal connections and your personal relationships. ولا تسأموا أن تكتبوه صغيرا أو كبيرا إلى أجله. أجله, right? Yeah. Do not be opposed to writing a contract for a fixed period, whether the amount is small or large. So it doesn't matter whether it's a lot of money or a little bit of amount of money that you're borrowing, you should write it down in yours. So a lot of people will be like, it's only like $20. It's not such a big deal. Why make a big deal out of it? I don't mind losing $20. But you know what will happen? It's not about the amount of money. It's about if something goes wrong, the feeling you're going to have towards the other person. This person, man, we said 30, and now he's only giving me 20. And he doesn't remember. And the other person thinks, no, this person forgot. And now it messes up. It doesn't matter. $5 can mess up a relationship. Not because of the amount of money. It's like, you couldn't even remember something like this. Something so small you couldn't, you're not a trustworthy person. So it can mess up a relationship, and Allah doesn't want that to happen. So he says, don't have this. It's such a small amount. It's not a big deal. Every amount is a big deal because it's the principle. It's not the amount. So he says, don't be averse to that. ذَلِكُمْ أَقْسَطُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ وَأَقْوَمُ لِلشَّهَادَةِ وَأَدْنَى أَلَّا تَرْتَابُوا. So this, meaning this idea of including witnesses to the contract, is fairer. It's more fair in the sight of Allah. It's more appropriate for evidence. And it's a better way to remove doubts so that you don't have any type of doubt in your mind about something. So even when it comes to documents, you're like, well, written documents. Somebody wrote it. Even in that time, you're like, well, we have a document in writing. But witnesses are actually better in general than the documents, because the document, you can find a random document and you could be like, maybe it's not very clear in its language. You don't have somebody else who's there. Maybe something got lost in translation. But having witnesses on top of that is a way to kind of remove some of the doubts about how much was the amount, when was the time, and all that. And that's why until today, we still have witnesses in courts of law. Even though many people are not very reliable witnesses today, many people are not very honest. But still, the idea of having witnesses is still it's still commonplace, because it's one of the best ways to define things, right? And nowadays, like, you can forge a document. Someone can come up with a document and be like, look, I have this written document that he borrowed this money or whatever. It could be forged. So today, and you're like, well, we have, technology. Today we have what's called like deep fakes. We have audio deep fakes. We have video deep fakes. We have, pictures that can just be modified and everything. One of my friends, he took an audio clip of me. Basically, it's I'm not telling you to do this, but you could basically take any person who's got videos online. You can pay a few dollars, and you can basically have a computer software map the range and frequency of their voice, and then type in a new text, and that person will speak exactly that new text. And if you listen to the sound, you won't be able to tell the difference. So voice AI, yeah. So one of my friends, he did it to me, right? And he did like a joke on it, and he's like sending it out to a group of people. He's like, look, this is Mustafa speaking, right? And then he did it to Sheikh Umar Suleiman, right? And I sent it to Sheikh Umar Suleiman, and he was just he was just playing like a prank, but he said something like that Sheikh Umar would never say. It was something bad, right? And he was joking though. I sent it to Sheikh Umar, and he was just freaked out. He said, this is horrible, right? And then he tried to do it to Sheikh Yasser Qadi, and for some reason, his voice does not work with AI. Because it's something to do with his pitch or his tone or something like that. So everyone has a little bit different style, So, some voices work, some voices don't work. But the point is that you can fake a lot of these things. And that's why no matter what, despite all the technology that we have and everything, watermarks and all that, having witnesses still plays an important role. It's never 100%, but it plays an important role, because at some level, you got to have some trust for people around you. So you can't function as a society. Everybody's a liar across the board. Can't trust anyone for anything. You wouldn't eat a meal. You wouldn't go to a restaurant. This person maybe put poison in my food. You're never going to eat a burger, So you got to have some level of trust. So Allah still mentions about witnesses. إلا أن تكون تجارة حاضرة تديرونها بينكم فليس عليكم جناح ألا تكتبوها. Unless, meaning all these things about witnesses and all that and writing down, unless it's an immediate transaction, meaning it's a non-deferred, non-loan, it's a transaction like you're buying and selling something right now among yourselves, then there's no need for you to write it down. So when it comes to like documenting a loan that you're going to pay later, or what was a very common practice, and it's still common today, some places, where you buy something, but you're going to pay somebody later. So if you go to like one of these food trucks or something like that, if you work in one of those companies, people have like a tab. Some restaurants, maybe not so much anymore, but they used to go to a restaurant. If you go there regularly, you go and you buy something, and you have like a tab. So I'm going to pay you, at the end of the month. Keep writing down all the stuff that I'm buying, and I'm going to pay you at the end of the month. So it's like, I'll pay you later type of thing. So this was very common too. But saying, if you're not doing that and you're just transacting business right now, then it's okay if you don't have to write anything down. Because what's going to happen is every single time you have like, hey, you want to buy this candy bar? Yeah, I'll sell it to you for $1. Hold on. We need to write it down. Let's write down the transaction. On this date, I sold the candy bar for $1, and you handed it to me. And 2 witnesses, by the way, he's buying my candy bar. Makes life extremely difficult. So Allah is like, you know what? That would make things very difficult for people. So, just this is sufficient. You don't have to have a receipt every single time. It's not a necessary requirement. So you can go ahead and just trade it, and it's fine. You don't need to have those witnesses and those requirements. وَأَشْهِدُوا إِذَا تَبَايَعْتُمْ. But make sure to have witnesses when you trade. So it says you don't have to write everything down, but it's good to have some witnesses around, even when you're trading, so that someone's like, hey, seems like some merchandise and some cash trade was changed between these 2 people, in case somebody's like, hey, you just took that from me. Like, imagine you sell a candy bar and you take the $1. You're like, hey, you just stole my candy bar. You're like, but you have my $1. No, this was my $1. It was mine, though. It was in my pocket the whole time. It's like, so now you're like, what do you do? How do you prove that? It's always good to have some witnesses when you can. So, but you don't want to make your life so difficult where you have to document every single transaction that you make. وَلَا يُضَارَّ كَاتِبٌ وَلَا شَهِيدٌ. Let no harm come to the scribe or the witness. Scribe meaning the writer. So don't let any harm come to the writer. If you're like, telling the person who's writing, you have to write it like this, or, I want this to be done. The person is doing you a favor by writing it down. Don't harm them in any way. Wala shahid. Don't harm the witness. If you come in there and you're like, the person says, you were there, you saw it was $150, right? Come on, swear. I want you to swear. You grab him by the shirt. So you better tell the truth. That's not how you treat a witness, right? So the person is doing you a favor by witness. The person is doing you a favor by writing. Don't harm people who are doing you a favor and helping you. وَإِن تَفْعَلُوا فَإِنَّهُ فُسُوقٌ بِكُمْ. If you do, then it is sinful of you. So if you harm them, then this is a sinful act that you are engaging in. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ. Be mindful of Allah. وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهِ. Allah teaches you, meaning Allah teaches you these rules about what is good for you. So He's giving you all these rules so that you can have a better society. وَاللَّهُ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ. Allah knows everything. So all of that was one verse. So one page, one verse. Longest verse in the Qur'an. Now, the one point maybe we'll spend a little bit of time on is the women being witnesses. So this is a common question that people always ask to say, well, why do you have to have one man and two women witnesses in place of one man instead? So you still have to have two men, but why, if there's one man, why do you have to have two women? So first of all, if you look at other religions, like for example in Jewish law, women were not allowed to be witnesses at all, right? So they're not even allowed to witness on anything. When it comes to things like narration, like about something that happened, you don't need to have two women. This is only in the category mainly of economics or contracts or something like that. So for example, in the month of Ramadan, scholars have a few different views here, but generally you need to see someone sees the moon, then the month has started. So if a man sees the moon and a woman sees the moon, do you need to have two men or one man and two women in order to validate that the moon has been seen? No. One man sees it or one woman sees it, it's sufficient. When it comes to narrating a hadith, if one companion who's male narrates a hadith and said the Prophet, peace be upon him, said this, or one woman, Aisha or Salama, whoever, narrates a hadith, says the Prophet, peace be upon him, said this, do you need to have two women for the one man when it comes to narrating hadith? The answer is no. When it comes to pregnancy, witnessing about what happened during a pregnancy. So just think about what being a witness means. In this context of economics, right? Witnesses are only needed if there's a problem and there's a dispute. So if somebody says, you know what, he owed me 150, he said, no, it's 100, or this or that, then you're going to call people and say, we have to have like a little court set up, and the witnesses are going to testify to what they've seen, right? So you're in basically, there's a conflict that already happened. There's a fight going on. So there's competing claims. So you're basically in a court. That's what you only need witnesses when there's a fight, an argument taking place. So what happens is when this could be in the field of economics, this could be in the field of marriage, for example. So somebody pronounces divorce to somebody else. Say, I never pronounced divorce. Say, yes, you did. Fine, let's go to court. Let's go to a Muslim judge and say, okay, what are the words that you said? He said, I said this. He said, no, you didn't. You said this. No, you didn't. You said this. Were there any witnesses? Okay, so now we need witnesses to testify because there's an argument taking place between two people. So there can be many arguments about many things. There's different categories of arguments and lawsuits and stuff like that people have. Among the arguments that people have is when it comes to pregnancy, when it comes to childbirth, when it comes to things like that. So women used to be called in to give testimony about different things, and men would be called in to give testimony. So what the scholars have said on this is that when it comes to pregnancy and childbirth and other things like that, they say males are not allowed to be witnesses in that category. Only women are allowed to be witnesses because they're specialized in they're there, right? there shouldn't be men sitting in the room generally when like a baby's being delivered to figure out what happened during that delivery and all the details and everything. Women have a higher priority in being witnesses in that domain, in that realm, which kind of gives a hint at this had to do with something that was built into the culture, right? Of men generally understood economic contracts better. They had a they had a better understanding of how things function and all that stuff. So all of that plays a little bit of a role, So this idea exists within the field of economics in this verse, but you find that if you look at what scholars have said throughout history, they did not say that this applies to all domains and all fields. Hadith being like the best example, or Quran being the best example. If someone's going to narrate and say the Prophet, peace be upon him, transmitted this, these verses from the Quran, this is how I recited, or this is how I learned the Quran, you don't need to have an additional witness. When it comes to Hadith, you don't need to have an additional witness. So then what happened was, I know this is like a popular topic, so I'm going to spend just a little bit more time addressing this. So there are two main opinions in Islamic scholarship that came out. One opinion was that they said the reason for this is because when it comes to things like economic contracts, women don't have the same level of retention of details on contracts like this. And there's an interesting set, and several scholars have said stuff like that. And I have a bunch of research on it, but I'm just going to summarize the argument. There's a recent study that came out from one of the universities. It says males were more accurate and less suggestible about the male-oriented items, about their recollection, while females were more accurate and less suggestible about the female-oriented items. This finding provided clear support for the hypothesis that females and males tend to be accurate on different types of items, perhaps indicating their differential interest in particular items and corresponding differential amounts of attention paid to those items. Basically, what the argument is, they say, if we agree with the theory, a pretty widely held theory, that men tend to have a very different way of thinking about certain things in the world, and women have a different way of thinking about certain things in the world. Like, for example, it is a fact that men process language primarily on the left side of the brain, and women process language on which side of the brain? Both sides. So they process language on both sides. And they say that's why girls almost always outperform boys in language development, because the way in which they process language tends to be a lot more complex, a lot more emotional, a lot more intuitive, things like that. So there's a physiology design, there's a physical difference between men and women in terms of the way in which they process information. This is well known and documented in biology. The question is, to what extent does that translate? To what extent does that actually affect people's ability for recognition? Now, these studies are like biological hard science. Then there's kind of like research, which is probably mostly true, which basically shows that men and women, it's not about men and women having one has a better memory than the other. It's more about one has a better memory about one type of information, and another has a better memory about another type of information. So somebody who's really interested in cars, and they go visit a car show, and they're like, now tell me, what did you see on the cars? They're like, well, I saw this and had this engine, had this horsepower. Then you ask the other person who doesn't care about cars at all, what did you see? I saw like red, blue, there was, I didn't see any gold. If it was like my daughter, she'd be like, I didn't see any pink cars. I thought it was kind of boring. It didn't have good colors there or something like that. And somebody else would be like, they had the engines and the this. So what you're interested in is naturally going to cause you to recall those things. Whereas if you take a guy and you put him in like a flower exhibit or something like that, like what kind of variety of flowers did you see? You see, most women would be like the flowers and the smell and the aroma and the this and that. The guy's going to be like, there's a lot of flowers. That's all I noticed. I didn't get the details because they're not interested in that generally by nature. There's some things that most people more men are generally interested in some things by nature, women interested in some other things by nature. So if this theory is correct, and so many scholars came up with the idea, and they said because of this natural interest that other people have, men had the expertise and the interest in economics where they would remember the details of what's going on. And it's not just about recollection of details. This is about recollection of details when you're being cross-examined as a witness. It's very stressful if you're a witness. You're being interrogated. And when you're being interrogated, you are basically like under stress. You're like, remember the details? I remember what happened. I can't remember what happened. I want to know, where were you standing? What exactly did he say? Did he say $150? Did he use those words or did he use different words? People start to panic, when they're being when they're being questioned like that. So that is one theory among the scholars, and that became the dominant theory. There's a second theory by Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, and it's kind of based on their work. I've not been able to read full research, but there's a good article by Yaqeen Institute on this, and it's written by Dr. Tasneem Al-Keek, and she has kind of like a decent write-up on this. So she says that these very well-known Muslim scholars, Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim, who usually have like some very unique opinions, sometimes very, very insightful opinions on which are very different from what the other scholars say. They're basically saying that this had to do only because of the times men were primarily involved in economic contracts. So the women wouldn't understand the economic contracts. If we find a case where a woman can prove herself that she understands the economic contracts in a different society and she's like an expert in those things, you don't need to have the two witnesses thing, right? And then Dr. Tasneem Al-Keek says, at the end of the day, this is not even a requirement. This is more of a recommendation when it comes to witnessing. And it has not, the whole issue has nothing to do with women being less trustworthy than men. It's more about the detailed recollection of events and how they remember things, or their expertise in one subject across different cultures. So hopefully that gives you a little bit insight into that. The next verse is 283. وَإِن كُنتُمْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ وَلَمْ تَجِدُوا كَاتِبًا فَرِهَانٌ مَقْبُوضَةٌ. If you're on a journey and a writer cannot be found, then you can take something as collateral. So what collateral means is when you have an item that you're giving somebody in exchange for a loan. So if somebody comes and says, hey, can I borrow $100? You say, let's say I say, I need to borrow $100. And person says, yeah, okay, I can give it to you, but we don't have anything to write this down with, or I'm not sure if I can fully trust you. I don't really know you that well. I say, okay, you know what? I need the $100. I'm going to give you my watch. This is a pretty good watch. You can keep this watch until I pay you back. When I pay you back, you give me my watch back. But if I don't pay you back, you get to keep the watch and it's worth more than $100. So, it's at least $100. So the person now feels comfortable and says, okay, I can do that. I don't really need your watch, but I feel more comfortable knowing that I have something in my possession so that I know you're going to pay me back, most likely, or at least I can sell this watch. I can keep this watch. So say if you're on a journey, you can't find somebody who's going to write or some other reason, you can always take something as a collateral to secure your loan that you're giving. فإن أمن بعضكم بعضا فليؤدي الذي اؤتمن أمانته وليتق الله ربه. If you trust one another, meaning if you completely trust one another, you know each other really well, you're fine. Then you don't need to do those things. The borrower should make sure to fulfill the trust. So whoever's borrowing the money, they need to make sure that they're going to be paying this money back. Let them fear Allah, their Lord. So it's saying that if you trust the other person, you don't have to do this. So you can just you can skip all those precautions. So remember in the beginning, in the previous verse, I said it's a command, it's an imperative. Imperative usually means command, you have to do it. But here it's saying, you know what, if you really trust the other person, you don't need to do these things. But sometimes it's better you do it anyways. So Allah wanted to make your life easy and not make it so burdensome. But I'm telling you from experience, I have seen so many disputes in the Muslim community between friends that when they don't document things down, they don't make things super clear, it destroys friendships, destroys relationships. And once it's destroyed, it's very hard to build that. It's over then. Because once somebody says forgets and they're like, I know that this is what happened. And the other person also thinks, I know this is what happened. You're not going to be able to fix that situation. So it's the best thing is always have witnesses, document things as clearly as possible. The more documentation you have, the better, right? This is the problem in so many things. It's the problem in marriages. It's the problem in divorce. It's the problem in families when brothers borrow money from brothers, or when friends go into business with one another. Even when people borrow money from their very, very close relatives or something like that. I've seen so many disputes and fights. You can't imagine breakups within the family. And it's ugly. So there's a wisdom behind why Allah is emphasizing all of these things. وَلَا تَكْتُمُ الشَّهَادَةَ. Do not hide the testimony. Now, hiding the testimony means that if you're going to be a witness, don't hide the relevant details that you need to give if you become a witness. So what some witnesses will do is they're like, okay, tell me exactly what happened. Like, yeah, Hussein borrowed some money. And so how much was the amount? Well, it was pretty good amount. It's like, why don't you just give the details? What exactly happened? And they're trying to cover up some facts because they know if the facts come out, then it's going to give a different result than they wanted. So that's concealing the relevant details of the testimony. That's what a lot of people do. Like, well, why were you late? Why were you late to class? There was traffic today. Oh, there was traffic? Was there more traffic? Because traffic means two things, right? Traffic means there's cars on the road. Traffic also means there was more cars on the road than normal. You go, what's the normal delay? What time did you leave your house? Like, yeah, I left a pretty decent time. And if you look and say you left like very late, that's why it's late. So people will conceal information when they don't want to tell they won't tell the whole story in order to deceive people. Allah is saying, don't conceal any of that information when you're a witness. وَمَن يَكْتُمْهَا فَإِنَّهُ آثِمٌ قَلْبُهُ. And whoever conceals it, their hearts are indeed sinful. Now, it says their hearts because you're not saying it. So it's like, you're like, well, I didn't commit a sin because I didn't say anything that was a lie. So it's a very easy way to trick yourself. Be like, I didn't say anything wrong. But by concealing it in your heart, your heart is being sinful because you know what the net effect of concealing this information is. It's basically when you conceal information that needs to be known, you're presenting a different picture, even though you say, well, I didn't say anything wrong. Yeah, probably many lies or many deceptions in the world are based on literally true statements. The majority of the news is like literally true statements, but they're taken completely out of context. So you misunderstand what's going on and leads you to a different conclusion. And that's why I say in your heart, even though you didn't say it, your heart is sinful, actually. That's how bad it is. Wallahu bima ta'maluna alim. Allah knows what you do. All right. So, question. Yes. Meaning, will you who got the money stolen, or will the poor person who took the money get more or less? Got it. Well, first of all, if somebody steals your money and they're poor, it's still wrong, right? So the Robin Hood mentality is not in Islam. So it's not right, right? So you should actually go and get your money back from the people who stole your money. That's the first people you should get it back from. Now, if they stole your money and they ran away with it, and you ask Allah, oh Allah, somebody took my money, and even though they're poor, it was wrong what they did. Oh Allah, help me get my money back somehow. The best thing is you get your money back from that person. If they go away and they escape somehow, on the day of judgment, Allah is going to hold them accountable, and you're going to get their good deeds back because they stole your money. And if Allah decides to give it back to you in another way, He could do that in this life, or He could give it to you in the next life. Okay? Okay. All right, other questions? Yes. Back.
question in terms of like, let's say, like business debts. If you, the business obviously very tricky, credit is very tricky too. Let's say you start a business and like things don't work out, you accumulate a bunch of debts. Obviously, like, the creditors at a certain point in time, they'll wipe off the debts off their books, you go to like the collection agent and stuff like that. And then so now it's like not the creditors' debts, it's just a collection agency trying to collect that debt, but obviously buy from say a bank for pennies on a dollar, right? So in that scenario, is there a way to like even out the debt where you pay charity or do other something else to kind of even that out because the bank is obviously not collecting debt anymore, or like the credit not collecting debt anymore because the collection is collecting debts. I'm curious about how that works.
Okay, so basically your question is, if you have a debt and the debt is going to be canceled due to non-payments, legally, meaning like, in the country or the county in which you live, they're going to legally cancel it. Are you still Islamically obliged to pay it? And if they won't accept your money, can you give some type of charity to offset whatever you didn't pay? So the general rule on this is, if you have the money to pay it and you're not paying it and you're kind of hiding that and concealing that money, then that's sinful. You should not be doing that, right? So that's the first point. Second point is, if you really legitimately don't have it and the laws of the land state that these things get canceled out or sold or transferred or something like that, whatever the judgment there is in that capacity, that judgment removes your liability, unless you're able to pay it back. So if it's to an individual and you get the money back later, your goal is to go and pay that individual back. You still have an Islamic responsibility to pay that individual back. If it comes to like some bank or something like that, they've written it off. There's no way you, even if you walk into the bank, you're like, here's the $10,000 I owe you. They're like, it's already been written off legally. We cannot even collect this. We can't even take this as an option. You don't have to give something in charity, but if you did, it would be a pious thing. Beneficial.
Yeah, because I mean, you're paying like the credit off, and then they probably like, let's say that whatever balance could be X balance. You probably already made the money back anyway with the interest, anyways.
Yeah. Yeah. So regardless of whether they made their money back, you're supposed to still pay them. But if you're not able to, oftentimes you're unable to even give it to them later on when you're able to pay them. If you're not, then you're absolved from the liability, but you should do something as like sadaqah at some level, not at the exact same amount, but something. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really like what you said about the witnesses where this woman that is BP and she's being called being a witness for finance, right? She be an excellent witness, right? So then you only need one, right? So and I've seen this myself, right? Like the software engineers, like okay, 90% of them are men, but I've met women engineers that are way better than a lot of men that are right? Special cases. So how widespread is this opinion? I think you mentioned Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah, and there was another one. What about that? There's no student.
Yeah.
What about
So I've not come across any other scholars. There could be, right? But I've not come across any other classical scholars that took this opinion. You'll find 20th century scholars, many of them have taken this opinion. And in the article of Tasneem Al-Keek, she mentions a lot of those in her footnotes. So I recommend you check out that article. It's actually very short. It's about 5 misconceptions about women, and it's only one section. It's like a page or two, pretty short. And all the footnotes mentions all of that. And someday, it's on my to-do list, to research this more and have like a separate article of more people who have taken that position. But I've only come across 2 classical scholars so far. Okay. Other questions? Okay, then we have our last class for this surah next week. So we'll see you next week, inshallah. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Also, 2 reminders. One, we have an upcoming Bosnia trip. Anyone who could join us, we just booked our tickets. You should really come with the family. Second reminder, June 24th, we have a event about the rainbow LGBT movement. So come for that, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.